Ladies and gentlemen, a more CPC welcome for Bill Vischer.
Hello. How's everybody doing today? Welcome to sunny this Florida. Sunny and warm, where you can go swimming at any time of the day or night because it's so sunny and warm.
Mr. Lutz, I'm not sure your thought is correct.
No, it was very warm today.
I think you're making it up.
No, it's the power of positive thinking. If you imagine it is warm, then it is warm.
How did that work for you when you jumped in the pool?
I can't feel my feet.
You don't have any feet.
That might explain it. Hi guys. I'm back. Oh, thank you. People all around me. I don't really like speaking in the round. And I'll let you in on a little secret of why that is. I don't really have a butt. And when you're standing behind a podium, no one ever notices that you don't have a butt. My wife says that that's not something you should ever complain about. But my kids make
Baby got back.
You know, it's one thing to be heartless or gutless, but it's another thing to be buttless. I'm not even sure what it means, but I don't think it's good. Anyway, so I'm putting my no butt on the line and speaking to you in the round. I was here, this one, I think 5 years ago or so, and I told the first half of a story. And I was also in San Diego the same year and told the first half of the same story. And then for some reason, like 2 years later, I went back to San Diego and told the second half of the story, but I never came back here to tell the second half of the story. And so it occurred to the powers that be that the entire eastern seaboard is waiting with bated breath to hear the second half of the story. Now, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about because you weren't even here 5 years ago, but you know, go buy the DVD and listen to it very quickly, and I'll pause and wait for you. Okay, good. So, it's time for the second half of the story. I have been, over the last 5 years, speaking to a lot of children's ministry workers, people in ministry, especially working with children. And I've noticed quite often when I'm standing up looking out at a sea of children's ministry workers that they look tired. That they look a little fatigued, a little stressed, like they're living on the edge of burnout. I noticed that they look a lot like I did 5 to 10 years ago, living on the edge of burnout. The year was 1997. We had just finished, I think, the 7th VeggieTales video, which was Madame Blueberry. And it was, you know, the best one yet, and it just kept getting better, and sales just were exploding, and our distributor was so excited they flew up from Nashville and they took us out and gave us a big lunch and a plaque, and everyone was so happy that things were going so well. But driving home from that lunch that day, I started to get chest pain. And that evening it was gradually getting worse and worse, and so finally that night I couldn't sleep. So about 2 in the morning I got up and I drove myself to the emergency room, and I didn't even tell my wife. That's not a good idea. And within about 5 minutes of walking into the emergency room, I found myself flat on my back on a gurney under a sign that said critical. And the nurse came over to do something, and I was looking up, kind of bemused, and I said, well, why does that say critical? And she said, because you're critical. And I could tell by the look on her face that she wasn't joking. Once they finally got a cardiologist awake to look at the EKG, they realized, okay, no, it doesn't look like he's having a heart attack, it's something else. So they ran some more tests and came back and said, you have pericarditis. Pericarditis is a viral infection in the lining of your heart. In other words, when you catch a cold and it's in your sinuses, instead of going to your sinuses, it goes to your heart, to the lining around your heart, and that little area starts to fill with fluid, and off your heart, which I guess is bad. But it's treatable, and so they put me on heavy antibiotics, and I was in bed for most of 2 weeks. Knocked my energy level down for about a year and a half, which they said is pretty common with pericarditis. So my wife is obviously very curious, why did he get this? Why didn't he just get a cold like normal people? So she went in and we were talking to the doctor, and he said, well, how do you get pericarditis? And the doctor looked at my wife and said, did you ever much stress? The next year, I got strep throat. The year after that, I got shingles, an ailment that typically afflicts the very old or the very frail. I was under so much stress that I finally started to see a Christian counselor to talk it through. And this was really at the peak of the success of VeggieTales. One of the days I met with the counselor happened to be the day of the Columbine shootings. And after listening to the latest news reports on the radio in the car in the parking lot, I walked in to the session and you could see how upset I was. And I said, well, have you heard the latest? Have you heard how bad it is? He said yes, but he wanted to know what I was feeling. And he asked, and I sat there for a minute, and suddenly tears came to my eyes, and I realized exactly what I was feeling. I could have done something. If only I had done more sooner. If only I had worked harder. Maybe things could have been better. Maybe the media that those boys were consuming wouldn't have been so toxic. Maybe this wouldn't have happened. I should have done more. He was quiet for a moment and then said, that's quite a burden to carry around. I nodded. Yes, it was. I was carrying an immense burden to save the world, to make a difference, to offset the evil streaming out of Hollywood, to save children from the evil of Hollywood, to do as much as I could, as fast as I could. It was the first thing I thought about in the morning and the last thing I thought about at night. And it was making me miserable. It was killing me. I was not a happy person. And then something interesting happened. I was sitting in bed one night, next to my wife, reading Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And for the first time, it occurred to me what Paul meant. I mean, I was familiar with the fruit of the Spirit, but I'd always kind of looked at it as an obligation, a duty, something else I had to do while I was saving the world. If you are a Christian, you have to act loving, you have to act joyful, you have to be kind and patient and self-controlled. I looked at it like homework. Oh great, something else I have to do. But now I saw what Paul really meant. If you're filled with the Spirit, these attributes will flow out of you whether you want them to or not. For an apple tree, producing apples isn't an obligation. It can't be helped. No apple tree accidentally produces grapes and then says, oh, darn it, I messed up again. An apple tree produces apples for the simple reason that it is an apple tree. And the Holy Spirit produces the fruit of the Spirit in the life of a believer for the simple reason that he is the Holy Spirit. If someone is filled with the Spirit, these attributes will fall out of them effortlessly and naturally. It can't be avoided. I turned to my wife and said something that surprised her. I don't think I'm a Christian. Not what she expected to hear from her creator and VeggieTales husband. I read her the fruit of the Spirit and then said, none of these are coming out of me. I am not joyful. I have no peace. I am not filled with love. I am stressed. I am cranky. I am fatigued. I am anxious. And none of those are on the list. Something is wrong with me. Something was wrong with me, but I didn't know what. Now, if you heard the first half of my story 5 years ago, or whatever that was, or if you've read my book, Me, Myself, and Bob, available on Amazon.com, you know what happened next. My world fell apart. I lost my business, my characters, my ministry, the edifice I had built around myself, my means for making a difference. Was all carried away. God stood back and let it all fall apart. And then he showed me what I had done, how I had made the work I was doing for him more important to me than my relationship with him. He showed me how miserable I had become, how I was carrying this burden, dragging this rock uphill that he never intended me to carry. A burden, in fact, that only he could carry. Only one person has ever lived who could actually save the world, and his name wasn't Phil. So I gave up that burden. I let it go. I put down the rock I grieved for so long, and I rested. And I read the Bible, and I prayed, and I felt God's love for me. A love so strong, he was willing to let all the good work I was doing for him fall apart to save me from myself. That freaked me out. The great works I was doing for God weren't as important to him as I was. Wow. Then pretty soon the fruit of the Spirit started to emerge, like daffodils poking up through the snow. I felt peace. I felt joy. I felt love. My wife noticed. She liked it. I spent a few months like this after the collapse of my ministry, resting, reading the Bible, feeling God's love for me. I wrote a couple of children's books, one of them about God's love, not surprisingly. But I didn't do much else. I sort of felt like a high-powered executive after a nervous breakdown, just shuffling around the house in his bathrobe and slippers, waving to the neighbors with a goofy grin on his face. Or like a star race car driver recovering at home after a horrendous crash, sitting with a little Fisher-Price plastic steering wheel, pretending to drive. And I thought, is this it? Am I done now? Will I just spend the rest of my life writing a few children's books, shuffling around in my slippers? I mean, it was great not to feel so burdened, but was this it? And then something happened at the park. I was in an office at that point, not far from my house, and there was a park a block away from the office, and it was spring, and it was pretty out, so every day I'd go to the little deli next door, buy a sandwich, and then shuffle down in my slippers and bathrobe to the park and sit on a park bench and eat my sandwich. It was really pretty. It was really peaceful. And then one day, as I was sitting there on the park bench eating my sandwich, two little girls ran across in front of me. They were sisters, like 5 and 3. And they were chasing each other, and they were climbing up on stuff, and they were going around the fountain. And then I saw their mom, young mom, chasing after them with the stroller, trying to keep them safe, trying to keep them out of trouble. And my heart went out to her because I have girls. They're older now. And I know what the world has set up for those girls. I know how short the time is where they will go from Barney and Blue's Clues to MTV and Abercrombie and Fitch. How the cute, innocent smiles of 4- and 5-year-old girls quickly change to the jaded looks of 13-year-old girls who know their only value in this world is their ability to attract the opposite sex. And my heart went out for her. And I wanted to help her. I thought, well, how could I help that mom? And I thought, okay, we live in such a media-saturated culture, and it's so brand-aware. If only I could create some kind of a media brand that she could trust, that would be good for her all the time. And then, in an instant, I thought, that's what Big Idea was supposed to be. Well, that's why I started all this in the first place. In an instant, all the bankruptcy proceedings and the lawyers and the insurance and all the mess disappeared, and I could see all the way back to the very beginning, to the call I felt to help a messy world find a holy God.